There's something about avoidance that keeps people hooked, confused, and emotionally exhausted all at the same time. It's like trying to hold on to someone who's always slipping through your fingers. One moment they're warm, present, and deeply connected, and the next, they're distant, cold, and unreachable. And the truth is, most people don't walk away not because they don't see the red flags, but because they don't understand what they're dealing with. This is not just about love, it's about emotional survival. Because when you get involved with someone who avoids intimacy, you're not just in a relationship, you're in a constant battle between connection and distance. And most people simply aren't built to handle that. At the beginning, it doesn't feel toxic, it feels intoxicating. There's a certain intensity in the way they show up, not consistently but powerfully enough to leave an imprint. They don't give you everything, but they give you just enough to make you lean in closer. Just enough attention, just enough vulnerability, just enough emotional presence to make you feel like something real is building. And that's where the hook begins. Because right when you start to feel safe, right when you start to believe that this connection is growing into something stable, they pull away. Not slowly, not gently, but suddenly. Their energy shifts. Their responses become shorter. The warmth you felt begins to fade into distance, and you're left sitting there, trying to understand what just happened. So you start thinking, maybe you said something wrong. Maybe you came on too strong. Maybe you misread everything. And instead of stepping back, you step forward. You try harder. You give more. You become more patient, more understanding, more available, hoping that if you just adjust yourself enough, things will go back to how they were. But that's the trap. Because as soon as you begin to pull back, trying to protect your own energy, they return. The same person who felt distant suddenly becomes attentive again. They reach out. They reconnect. They remind you of why you felt so drawn to them in the first place. And in that moment, it feels like relief, like maybe things are finally balancing out. But they're not. It's a cycle. A pattern that keeps repeating itself. Closeness followed by distance. Connection followed by withdrawal. And the unpredictability of it all is what makes it so powerful. Because your emotions are constantly being pulled in two different directions. You're either chasing the closeness or recovering from the distance. And over time, that emotional back and forth begins to take a toll on you. You find yourself checking your phone more often, analyzing every message, noticing every small change in their behavior. You start overthinking things you never used to question. Silence feels heavier, delays feel intentional, and your peace of mind slowly begins to disappear. What once felt exciting now feels exhausting. Because love isn't supposed to feel like you're constantly trying to earn someone's presence. It's not supposed to feel like you're always one step away from losing them. But with this dynamic, stability never fully arrives. There's always this underlying tension, this feeling that something could shift at any moment. And the hardest part is, you become emotionally invested in the highs. Those moments when they are fully present, fully engaged, fully connected, they feel so real, so meaningful, that you start holding on to them. You start believing that those moments represent the truth of who they are. So you stay, even when the lows begin to outweigh the highs, even when the distance becomes more frequent than the connection. You stay because you've already felt what it could be, and you keep hoping it will return. But hope in this situation becomes exhausting. Because instead of experiencing love as something steady and secure, you're constantly riding emotional waves, never knowing when the next drop will come. And that uncertainty slowly drains you, mentally, emotionally, even physically. Most people can't handle this not because they're weak, but because they're wired for consistency, for connection, for emotional safety. And when those basic needs aren't met, no amount of attraction or chemistry can compensate for it. Eventually, you reach a point where you realize something important. It's not that you're asking for too much. It's that you're asking the wrong person. And by the time that realization fully settles in, you're already exhausted from trying to make something unstable feel secure. There's a confusing contradiction at the core of their behavior. They desire connection, but at the same time, they're deeply uncomfortable with it. And if you're someone who leads with love, openness, and emotional availability, this dynamic can leave you feeling like you're constantly doing something wrong, even when you're not. Because in the beginning, they show signs that they want closeness. They engage in deep conversations. They share parts of themselves that feel personal, even vulnerable. They create moments that feel emotionally real. And in those moments, it's easy to believe that they're ready for something meaningful. It feels like progress, like something is building. But as soon as that connection starts to deepen, as soon as things begin to feel consistent, secure, or emotionally intimate, something shifts inside them. It's subtle at first, a slight pullback, a delay in response, a change in tone. But then it grows into distance, not because the connection wasn't real, but because it became too real. Closeness for them can feel overwhelming. It triggers something they don't always understand themselves. A need for space, a need to regain control, a need to protect themselves from emotions they've learned to avoid. So instead of leaning in, they step back. And that's where the confusion begins for you. Because you're left trying to understand how someone can go from being so emotionally present to suddenly feeling unavailable. You replay conversations in your mind, searching for the moment everything changed. You question your words, your actions, your intentions. But the truth is, it's not about something you did. It's about something they feel. They want connection, but only up to a certain point. They can handle the idea of closeness, but not the full weight of it. And when things cross that invisible line, they retreat, not out of rejection, but out of discomfort. The problem is, they don't always communicate this clearly. They don't say, "I'm overwhelmed," or "I need time to process." Instead, they create distance in ways that feel confusing, becoming less responsive, less expressive, less emotionally available. So you try to fill in the gaps. You give them space, hoping they'll come back. You stay patient, believing they're just going through something. You hold on to the version of them that made you feel seen, hoping that version will return consistently. And sometimes it does. They come back with warmth again. They reconnect. They make you feel close again, just enough to remind you of what you felt before. And in those moments, it's easy to believe that things are finally stabilizing. But then it happens again. Another retreat. Another emotional shutdown. Another wave of distance that leaves you questioning everything all over again. And this cycle becomes exhausting, not because there's no connection, but because the connection is inconsistent. It's there one moment, gone the next. Real, but unreliable. Most people can't handle this because love is meant to grow with time, not disappear every time it starts to deepen. You shouldn't have to second guess whether someone can handle your presence in their life. You shouldn't feel like your love is too much just because someone else isn't equipped to receive it. But in this dynamic, that's exactly how it feels. You start shrinking parts of yourself, holding back your emotions, avoiding conversations that might feel too deep just to keep things from falling apart. You begin to walk on emotional eggshells, trying not to trigger their distance. And slowly, without realizing it, you start abandoning your own needs just to maintain a connection that was never stable to begin with. That's why it becomes so hard to stay grounded in something like this. Because you're not just loving someone, you're constantly adjusting yourself to fit within their comfort zone. And no matter how much you care, that kind of love will always feel incomplete. Communication is supposed to be the bridge between two people. It's how understanding is built, how trust grows, and how emotional safety is created over time. But in this dynamic, communication doesn't feel like a bridge at all. It feels like a wall you're constantly trying to climb, only to realize there's nothing stable on the other side. Because instead of clarity, you get fragments. Instead of direct answers, you get silence. Instead of emotional expression, you get withdrawal. And when someone avoids emotional depth, you are left trying to interpret what was never clearly said in the first place. At the beginning, it might not seem like a problem. In fact, it can feel mysterious, even intriguing. They might be expressive in short bursts, saying just enough to keep you engaged but never fully opening up. You feel like you're getting closer, like trust is slowly being built. But as soon as conversations start moving into deeper emotional territory, feelings, expectations, consistency, something shifts. They go quiet. They change the subject. They become less responsive. Or they respond in a way that feels emotionally flat, like they're present but not really there. And suddenly, you're left in uncertainty. And uncertainty is where the mind starts working overtime. You begin analyzing everything. A delayed reply isn't just a delay, it becomes a sign. A short message isn't just a short message. It becomes a message filled with hidden meaning. Silence isn't just silence. It becomes a space where your thoughts run wild, trying to fill in what's missing. Most people can't handle this because emotional security depends on clarity. When communication is open, honest, and consistent, the mind relaxes. But when communication is inconsistent, the mind becomes hyperactive, always searching for answers that never fully arrive. And the hardest part is that you start blaming yourself for the confusion. You ask yourself if you're asking for too much, if you're being too emotional, if you should just calm down or not take things so seriously. So instead of demanding clarity, you start minimizing your needs. You start accepting less communication just to avoid feeling like you're overwhelming someone. But the truth is, clear communication is not a burden. It's a basic emotional requirement in any healthy connection. With avoidant patterns, however, emotional conversations often feel threatening to the other person. Not because they don't care at all, but because vulnerability feels unsafe to them. So instead of engaging, they withdraw. Instead of explaining, they distance themselves. And instead of resolving emotional tension, they avoid it completely. This creates a painful loop for the other person. You reach out for clarity, they pull away for space. You try harder to understand, they become even less available. And eventually, you find yourself talking less about what you feel. Not because you don't feel it, but because you're afraid of pushing them further away. So communication becomes filtered, controlled, carefully measured. You stop saying what's really on your mind. You start choosing words that feel safe. You avoid difficult conversations. And slowly, the relationship begins to lose emotional depth. Not because feelings are gone, but because expression has been restricted. And in that silence, assumptions start growing. You assume they don't care as much. They assume you're being too intense. Neither side is fully understood because nothing is being fully expressed. And what remains is a relationship built more on interpretation than actual communication. Most people can't handle this because love without communication doesn't feel like connection. It feels like guessing. And no one can feel emotionally secure in a space where they are constantly guessing what the other person feels. Over time, this lack of clarity creates emotional fatigue. You become tired of wondering, tired of waiting, tired of decoding. And what once felt like a meaningful connection slowly turns into a mental puzzle you can never fully solve. Because real connection doesn't leave you guessing. It leaves you understood. One of the most painful dynamics in these connections is not what is said, but what is never said at all. Because avoidant patterns don't always express rejection directly. Instead, they express it through absence, distance, inconsistency, and emotional withdrawal. And that silence can make someone feel incredibly replaceable, even when nothing is explicitly ending. At first, it doesn't feel that extreme. In fact, it can feel like you matter. They respond, they engage, they show interest in their own way. But as time passes and emotional depth begins to grow, something changes in their level of investment. Not always in dramatic ways, but in subtle shifts. Slower replies, shorter conversations, less curiosity about your emotional world. And the dangerous part is that there is no clear ending point. There is no conversation that says, "I'm pulling away from you." There is no moment where you are told, "You don't matter." Instead, there is just a gradual fading of presence. And that fading creates confusion, because the mind naturally tries to explain absence. If someone matters, they should show it. If someone cares, they should act like it. But when behavior becomes inconsistent, your mind starts filling in the gaps with questions like, "Am I not important anymore? Did I do something wrong? Is someone else replacing my place?" And even if none of those things are true, the emotional experience feels like they are. This is why most people struggle so deeply in this dynamic, because emotional security isn't only about being loved, it's about being actively chosen. And when effort disappears, even if feelings remain, it starts to feel like you are no longer a priority. The absence of urgency is what hurts the most, because when someone values your presence, there is a natural effort to maintain connection. There is consistency. There is emotional engagement. But when that effort becomes unpredictable, you start feeling like you are waiting for attention instead of receiving it freely. And that waiting slowly changes your self-perception. You begin to question your own value. Not openly, not consciously at first, but internally. You start wondering why you have to try harder to maintain something that once felt mutual. You start noticing that you are the one initiating more, checking in more, trying to keep the emotional thread alive while the other person drifts in and out. And every time they return after a period of distance, it resets your hope. Because their return feels like confirmation that the connection still exists. They act normal again. They engage again. They give you just enough warmth to remind you of what it felt like in the beginning. And in that moment, you forget the distance that came before it. But then the cycle repeats. They pull back again, not with explanation, but with emotional withdrawal. And each time it happens, it leaves a deeper imprint, not because of what is happening now, but because of what it is starting to represent in your mind. That maybe you are not as important as you thought. And that belief is what makes this dynamic so difficult to leave. Because most people don't leave when they feel unloved. They leave when they feel unseen. When effort is missing. When emotional presence feels inconsistent. When they start feeling like they are an option rather than a priority. And avoidant patterns often create exactly that experience without ever directly stating it. So you stay in a loop where you are constantly trying to understand where you stand, trying to decode behavior that keeps changing, trying to hold on to moments of connection that feel real even if they are not consistent. And over time, that inconsistency doesn't just affect the relationship, it starts affecting your self-worth. Because when someone makes you feel replaceable long enough, you start questioning whether you are. One of the most overlooked reasons people struggle in this dynamic is not just emotional attachment, it's self-abandonment. Because slowly, almost without noticing it, you begin reshaping yourself around someone else's emotional limits instead of your own emotional needs. And that shift doesn't happen in one moment. It happens in small decisions repeated over time. At the beginning, you show up fully. You express yourself. You ask questions. You share how you feel. You try to build something honest and open. But when you consistently receive mixed responses, warmth followed by distance, engagement followed by withdrawal, you start adjusting. Not because you want to, but because you want to keep the connection alive. So you begin to soften your expression. You start thinking before you speak. You start filtering your emotions. You avoid saying things that might feel too much. Not because your feelings changed, but because you learned that certain expressions lead to distance. And that's where the shift begins. Not in them, but in you. You start prioritizing stability over authenticity. You choose peace over honesty. You choose keeping them close over being fully seen. And in doing so, you begin shrinking parts of yourself that were once natural. You stop asking for clarity because you fear it might push them away. You stop bringing up emotional needs because you don't want to trigger withdrawal. You start tolerating inconsistency because at least inconsistency feels like presence, even if it's unstable. And over time, your emotional world starts revolving around their availability. If they are present, you feel okay. If they are distant, you feel anxious. If they return, you feel relief. If they disappear again, you feel confusion. Your emotional balance is no longer coming from within you. It is being regulated by someone who is not consistent. That is where self-abandonment becomes dangerous, because you begin to believe that maintaining the connection is more important than maintaining yourself. You start justifying behavior you once wouldn't accept. You start lowering your standards, not because you don't know better, but because you are afraid of losing the connection entirely. And the most painful part is that you start calling it love. You tell yourself you are patient, you are understanding, you are loyal. But underneath that, something quieter is happening. You are adapting yourself to fit inside emotional space that is not stable enough to hold you fully. And the more you adapt, the more disconnected you become from your own needs. You stop recognizing what you actually want. You stop checking in with your own emotional state. You become more focused on reading them than understanding yourself. At some point, you don't even realize how much you've changed. Until one day, you look back and notice that you are no longer expressing yourself the way you used to. You are no longer as open. You are no longer as emotionally free. You are operating in caution instead of truth. And that realization can feel heavy because it reveals that the connection didn't just affect your emotions, it reshaped your identity. Most people can't handle this kind of dynamic because it requires them to constantly suppress parts of themselves just to keep things from falling apart. And any relationship that requires you to disappear slowly in order to maintain it is already costing you more than it is giving. The truth is, real connection doesn't demand self-abandonment. It doesn't require you to shrink. It doesn't force you to silence your needs just to keep someone close. But in this pattern, you slowly trade authenticity for attachment. And what you gain in temporary closeness, you lose in long-term self-respect. And eventually, the hardest part isn't missing them. It's realizing how far you moved away from yourself just to keep them. Walking away sounds like a decision, but in this dynamic, it feels more like a battle between reality and emotional memory. Because even when the relationship is unstable, even when it's inconsistent, even when it repeatedly leaves you confused and emotionally drained, there are still moments that feel too real to fully let go of. And that's what makes it so difficult. It's not that you don't see the truth. Deep down you do. You recognize the pattern. You understand the distance. You feel the imbalance. But your emotional memory keeps pulling you back to the moments when everything felt aligned. The moments when they were present, attentive, and emotionally open. Those moments don't disappear just because the inconsistency exists. In fact, they become stronger in your mind over time, because the human brain tends to hold on to emotional highs more intensely than emotional lows. So even if most of the experience is confusion, the peak moments of connection feel like proof that something meaningful exists. And that proof becomes the reason you stay. You start telling yourself that maybe the timing isn't right. Maybe they're just going through something. Maybe if you're more patient, more understanding, more steady, they will eventually stay consistent. You begin to attach hope to their potential rather than their actual behavior. And that's where the internal conflict begins. Because one part of you is exhausted. That part wants clarity, consistency, and emotional safety. It wants to stop overthinking, stop waiting, stop decoding silence. But another part of you remembers the connection, remembers the warmth, remembers the version of them that made everything feel worth it. So you remain stuck between two emotional realities, what is happening and what you wish would happen. And the longer you stay in that space, the harder it becomes to leave. Because leaving isn't just about ending contact, it's about letting go of the possibility that it could become what you hoped it would be. And that possibility is often more powerful than the reality itself. Even when the distance becomes routine, even when the inconsistency becomes predictable, those rare moments of connection reset everything. A message, a call, a brief moment of emotional closeness, and suddenly, all the emotional pain gets overshadowed by temporary relief. And that relief is dangerous because it creates emotional dependency. You begin to associate their return with comfort, their attention with safety, their presence with emotional stability. So when they disappear again, the absence feels even more intense than before. It becomes a cycle of emotional withdrawal and emotional reward, and that cycle keeps you psychologically attached even when you logically know it's not stable. Most people don't realize that leaving isn't just a decision of logic. It's a process of emotional detachment. And emotional detachment is slow when the connection has been unpredictable but intense. You don't just walk away from the person, you walk away from the version of the relationship that only exists in your best memories. And that version often feels more real than the current experience. That's why walking away feels like loss, even when staying feels painful. Because you're not just releasing someone, you're releasing the hope, the potential, and the emotional story you built around what it could become. And in that moment, you realize something important. What makes it hard to leave is not their presence, but the emotional investment you placed into the idea of them. And letting go of that idea requires more strength than holding on ever did.